The night of July 18, 64 AD. A flickering spark, fanned by Rome's dry summer winds, ignites in the shops around the Circus Maximus. Within hours, it blossoms into an inferno. Flames leap from timber-framed insulae, devouring the ancient city street by street. Panic grips the imperial capital. Citizens, awoken by the roar of the blaze and the screams of their neighbors, flee through ash-choked streets, their faces illuminated by a hellish orange glow that turns night into a grotesque day. The great fire of Rome rages for 6 days and 7 nights, then reignites, burning for 3 more. A city built of wood and closely packed buildings becomes a crucible of destruction, reducing 2/3 of the known world's greatest metropolis to a landscape of smoldering ruins and countless dead. And where was the emperor, the man who ruled this vast, trembling empire? Legend, etched into the collective memory of humanity, paints a chilling picture. Perched on a high vantage point, possibly his palace on the Palatine Hill, or even from a villa miles away, Nero Claudius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, the 5th emperor of Rome, watched the catastrophe unfold. Not with horror, but with a perverse artistic fascination. Some say he donned theatrical garb, playing his lyre, and singing of the destruction of Troy, finding inspiration in Rome's agony. Nero, the mad emperor. Nero, the fiddler while Rome burned. Nero, the monster who cleared land for his grandiose golden house with the lives of his people. This is the image that has echoed through 2 millennia, a decadent, tyrannical artist king, indifferent to suffering, driven by hubris and cruelty. He is remembered as the matricide who murdered his mother, Agrippina, the first imperial persecutor of Christians, and the architect of his own downfall, eventually declared a public enemy and forced to commit suicide, crying, "What an artist dies in me!" But was he truly the embodiment of evil, a despotic psychopath whose reign brought Rome to its knees? Or was he a complex figure, a sensitive artist misunderstood by a ruthless political elite, a man whose artistic ambitions were crushed by the burdens of power and the whispers of a biased history, written by his enemies? In this documentary, we will delve into the turbulent and often gruesome reign of one of history's most infamous figures. We will unearth the truths and untangle the pervasive myths surrounding Nero, the last emperor of the revered Julio-Claudian dynasty. We will meticulously explore the brutal political intrigues, the controversial artistic aspirations that defined his identity, the shocking accusations of madness, and the devastating public events that irrevocably shaped his controversial era. Was he indeed the monstrous tyrant history so eagerly remembers, or a convenient scapegoat for Rome's deep-seated instability, a man perhaps trapped and twisted by the ruthless power struggles he could not ultimately escape? Join us as we journey back to the very heart of ancient Rome, to witness the dramatic rise and spectacular, bloody fall of an emperor whose name remains indelibly synonymous with infamy, a man whose complex legacy continues to ignite passionate debate. Nero. Born into a dynasty stained with blood and madness, his name would become a synonym for tyranny, a byword for decadent cruelty. But before he was the emperor who allegedly fiddled while Rome burned, before he became the self-proclaimed artist whose vanity dwarfed even his power, Nero was simply Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus, a boy unwittingly caught in the suffocating web of imperial ambition. His journey from an obscure patrician family to the most powerful man in the known world is a tale steeped in manipulation, murder, and the relentless machinations of one of history's most formidable women, his mother. Nero's story truly begins not with him, but with his family, the infamous Julio-Claudian dynasty, a lineage both divine and deeply depraved. He was born in 37 AD, the son of Gnaeus Domitius Ahenobarbus, a man described by the historian Suetonius as utterly despicable, notorious for his cruelty, debauchery, and violent temper. His mother, however, was the truly dangerous force, Agrippina the Younger. She was the great-granddaughter of Augustus, the first Roman emperor, and the sister of the infamous madman Caligula. She had witnessed the brutal capriciousness of imperial power firsthand, living through purges, exiles, and assassinations. These experiences didn't break her, they sharpened her. Agrippina was a woman of fierce intelligence, unyielding ambition, and a ruthlessness that would make Machiavelli blush. She saw in her infant son not just a child, but a vessel for her own ascent to power. In her mind, the throne of Rome was hers by right, and if she couldn't sit upon it directly, her son would be her proxy. Nero's early childhood was turbulent. His father died when he was only 3, leaving him an orphan. Caligula, his uncle and emperor at the time, was a monstrous figure, and Agrippina herself was exiled during his reign, forcing Nero to live with his aunt. But fate, or perhaps Agrippina's sheer will, soon intervened. Caligula was assassinated, and Claudius, Agrippina's paternal uncle, ascended to the purple. Claudius was an intellectual, a scholar, but politically naive and easily swayed, especially by strong-willed women. This was the opening Agrippina needed. She returned from exile, a widow with a young son, and set about securing her position. Her initial target was to secure an advantageous marriage, and by 49 AD, she had achieved the unthinkable. She married her uncle, Emperor Claudius, leveraging political connections and, it is rumored, a calculated seduction. This union, scandalous by Roman standards, was a masterstroke. Now, as empress, Agrippina could begin to steer the destiny of Rome, and more importantly, the destiny of her son. Claudius already had a legitimate son, Britannicus, by his previous wife Messalina. By all rights, Britannicus was the heir apparent. But Agrippina was relentless. She convinced Claudius to formally adopt Nero, who was then 13 years old. This was not a symbolic gesture. Adoption in Rome carried immense legal weight, placing Nero on equal footing with Britannicus. From that moment, Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus became Nero Claudius Caesar Drusus Germanicus. He was no longer just a patrician boy. He was a Caesar, a direct contender for the throne. Agrippina didn't stop there. She appointed the Stoic philosopher Seneca the Younger as Nero's tutor, a man of immense intellect and moral standing. Ostensibly, Seneca was to instill wisdom and virtue in the young prince. But perhaps Agrippina also understood the value of a brilliant public face for her ambitious project. Seneca diligently taught Nero rhetoric, philosophy, and Greek. Nero, however, showed a stronger inclination towards the arts, music, poetry, sculpture, and especially chariot racing, passions that would become both his solace and his downfall. Seneca tried to guide him, to temper his innate vanity and protect him from his mother's overbearing influence. But the seeds of self-indulgence had already taken root in the fertile, corrupted soil of the imperial court. As Nero matured, Agrippina systematically removed any rivals or obstacles to his succession. Palace intrigue thickened. Courtiers who sided with Britannicus found themselves exiled or worse. The final, and most critical, obstacle was Claudius himself. The emperor, increasingly infirm and perhaps beginning to recognize the sinister ambition of his wife, started to show renewed favor to his natural son, Britannicus. This was a threat Agrippina could not tolerate. On the 13th of October 54 AD, Emperor Claudius died suddenly. The official cause was illness, but few in Rome believed it. Whispers of poison spread like wildfire through the city, focusing on a dish of mushrooms, a favorite of the emperor, expertly prepared by Agrippina herself, or perhaps by his official poison tester, Locusta, acting under Agrippina's orders. Regardless of the precise method, the timing was too convenient, the outcome too perfect for Agrippina's plans. The old emperor, a pawn in the games of others until the very end, was gone. The path was cleared. The guards, loyal to Agrippina and swayed by promises, proclaimed Nero emperor. He was just 17 years old. The Senate, with no real power to resist, quickly ratified the decision. On that day, a young, aesthetically inclined, and deeply impressionable teenager ascended to the throne of the most powerful empire the world had ever known. Agrippina stood beside him, triumphant, believing her grand design complete. She had made her son emperor, and through him, she would rule. But the dark forces she had unleashed, the ambition she had fostered, would soon spin wildly out of her control, consuming not just Nero, but Rome itself. The boy, groomed for power, would soon reveal the monster lurking beneath the artist, setting the stage for a reign of unprecedented debauchery and terror. Nero's reign didn't begin with the cries of a burning city or the madness of a tyrant. No, it opened with a deceptive whisper of promise, a golden age that, for a brief, fleeting period, seemed to offer Rome a respite from the turmoil of imperial succession. The first 5 years of his rule, often hailed as the Quinquennium Neronis, were marked by unexpected stability, surprising reforms, and a veneer of popular benevolence. This was largely thanks to the careful hand of two powerful men, Seneca, his brilliant Stoic philosopher tutor, and Sextus Afranius Burrus, the formidable head of the Praetorian Guard. These two, a formidable intellectual and a shrewd military commander, formed an unlikely regency, working in concert to temper the young emperor's volatile nature and channel his energies towards sensible governance. Taxes were reduced, legal reforms implemented, and the Senate, for a time, was treated with a respect it hadn't seen in generations. Nero, the fresh-faced youth, seemed poised to be a different kind of emperor. But lurking in the shadows, and often very much in the light, was a third, equally powerful, and far more insidious force, Nero's mother, Agrippina the Younger. A woman forged in the crucible of imperial politics, Agrippina was a matriarch of fierce ambition, ruthless cunning, and an unshakable belief that she, through her son, was the rightful ruler of Rome. She had manipulated, poisoned, and schemed her way to this position, orchestrating Claudius's death and Nero's ascension, and she was not about to relinquish her grip. She saw her son not as an independent ruler, but as an extension of her own will, a puppet through whom she could secure her absolute dominance. She appeared at state functions, receiving foreign envoys, openly meddling in appointments, and even had her image struck on coins alongside Nero's. Her suffocating presence, her constant surveillance, and her attempts to undermine his mistress, became an unbearable affront to Nero's burgeoning desire for autonomy. The clash was inevitable, a collision course between a son desperate for freedom and a mother clinging to power. It began subtly, with whispered arguments, then escalated to public confrontations. Agrippina, emboldened by her past successes and her belief in her absolute authority, overplayed her hand, making threats to reveal that Nero was not the true heir, that he was merely a placeholder for Britannicus, Claudius's legitimate son. This was a direct challenge to Nero's legitimacy, an unforgivable affront that could not be tolerated. Britannicus, a mere 14-year-old, died shortly after, poisoned at a dinner party, with Nero looking on impassively. It was a chilling precursor, a cold calculation that foreshadowed the depths to which the young emperor would sink. Eliminating a rival was one thing, assassinating one's own mother, the woman who had put him on the throne, was another entirely. Yet, as Agrippina's influence waned, as her criticisms grew sharper, as her demands became more desperate, Nero's paranoia intensified. He saw her not as a mother, but as an existential threat, a dark cloud always looming over his burgeoning desire for absolute freedom. The decision was made. Agrippina had to die. But how to commit such a monstrous act without implicating the emperor, without sparking outrage among the Roman people who still remembered her powerful lineage and her own father, Germanicus? Nero, ever the theatrical, devised a plan as elaborate as it was cruel. In 59 AD, Agrippina was invited to a reconciliation banquet at Baiae, a luxurious coastal resort. The atmosphere was strained, yet outwardly cordial. As she prepared to return home across the moonlit waters of the Bay of Naples, Nero offered her a specially constructed pleasure boat. But this was no ordinary vessel. It was engineered to collapse, designed to sink in stages, making her death look like a tragic accident. As the boat sailed into the darkness, the roof of Agrippina's cabin collapsed, crushing one of her attendants. The ship's frame then split open with a grotesque cacophony of splintering wood. But fate, or perhaps Agrippina's sheer iron will to survive, intervened. Despite a wound to her shoulder, she was a strong swimmer. Amidst the chaos of drowning slaves and splintered wreckage, she managed to keep afloat, buoyed by the debris, until she was rescued by a passing fishing boat and taken to her villa. She knew immediately who was behind it. The message was clear: her son wanted her dead. The news of her miraculous survival sent Nero into a frenzy of fear and rage. He had failed. Now, Agrippina, wounded and enraged, would undoubtedly seek vengeance. There was no going back. He summoned Seneca and Burrus, openly declaring his intent to have her murdered directly. Even these hardened men, complicit in Britannicus's death, hesitated at the thought of direct matricide. Burrus famously refused to order his praetorians to spill imperial blood directly. But Nero found his eager accomplice in Anicetus, commander of the fleet at Misenum, a man with a personal vendetta against Agrippina. Anicetus, along with a few trusted centurions, stormed Agrippina's villa. They found her lying on her couch, awaiting her fate with a chilling composure. As the centurion drew his sword, she famously uncovered her womb and cried, "Strike here! This bore Nero!" She was brutally stabbed to death, her body later cremated that very night, without ceremony, a final, ignominious insult to a woman who had once wielded immense power. The mask had truly slipped. The murder of his mother, though initially spun by Nero as Agrippina's suicide after a failed plot against him, sent shockwaves through Rome. Nero, pale and trembling with guilt and terror, spent days in seclusion, haunted by nightmares. But the initial horror soon gave way to a chilling sense of liberation. With Agrippina gone, with the chains of maternal influence and moral guidance seemingly broken, Nero was free. Free to indulge his every whim, his every depraved desire. His true passion, long suppressed by the demands of imperial dignity, now exploded onto the public stage: art. This was not merely an appreciation for the arts, which was acceptable for a Roman aristocrat. No, Nero craved to be the artist. He saw himself as a magnificent singer, a brilliant poet, a master lyre player, and above all, an unparalleled actor and charioteer. This was not a hobby, it was a profound, almost spiritual calling for him. He built private theaters, held elaborate festivals like the Neronia, and composed endless, often mediocre, verses. He forced senators and nobles to attend his performances, often for hours on end, enduring his talents with feigned applause, because to be seen leaving was an unforgivable insult. He even went so far as to perform in public, a scandalous act that shattered centuries of Roman tradition. Emperors did not perform, they commanded. They did not sing on stage, they led armies. For Nero, however, the stage was his true calling, the applause his only currency. He would travel to Greece, competing in every major festival, rigging the results, of course, to ensure his victories, parading his awards, crowns, and laurels back to Rome with the pomp of a returning conqueror. This self-indulgent theatricality was deeply offensive to the Roman elite, a profound contempt for the very dignity of the emperorship. They watched in disgusted silence as their emperor, the divine Augustus's successor, stained his hands not with the blood of enemies, but with the grease paint of the actor. He was transforming the imperial palace into a stage, and Rome itself into his personal plaything. The early promise of his reign, the Quinquennium Neronis, was now a distant, bitter memory. The gentle guidance of Seneca and Burrus had utterly failed. The man, the artist-tyrant, had fully emerged. The fire, metaphorically and soon literally, was about to begin. The year is 64 AD. Rome, the eternal city, simmers under the oppressive July sun. Its narrow, winding streets are choked with timber tenements, workshop fires, and an ever-present haze of cooking smoke. 80% of its buildings are constructed from wood, packed tightly together like kindling, inviting disaster. It is a city ripe for incineration, a disaster waiting for its match. And on the night of July 18th, that match was struck. The great fire of Rome began in the shops around the Circus Maximus, where flammable goods and cheap oils ignited with terrifying speed. It was not a spark, but a monstrous breath that consumed everything in its path. Fanned by a relentless wind, the flames leaped from building to building, street to street, devouring Rome faster than any legion could march. The roar of the inferno became the city's new soundtrack, a symphony of destruction punctuated by the screams of the dying and the crash of collapsing structures. Panic erupted. The labyrinthine alleys that had always teemed with life now became death traps. Families were separated, swallowed by smoke and falling debris. Mothers clutched children, desperately seeking an escape that didn't exist. The rich fled in chariots, abandoning their possessions. The poor, with nowhere to go, ran in blind terror, often straight into the advancing wall of fire. The vast granaries along the Tiber, filled with Rome's food supply, exploded into towering pillars of flame, showering burning embers across the river and ensuring widespread famine would follow. For 6 days and 7 nights, the city burned, a hellish landscape of orange and black against the perpetually smoke-choked sky. And where was Emperor Nero, the man who called himself a god? He was miles away, at his villa in Antium, watching his capital burn. Or so the official story went. The whispers, however, told a different tale. They claimed Nero had deliberately started the fire, an act of monstrous megalomania, simply to clear space for his audacious architectural vision, the Domus Aurea, the Golden House, a sprawling palace that would make the gods envious. Some sources even claimed he stood on a private balcony, clad in theatrical costume, playing his lyre and singing of the destruction of Troy, as Rome, his own Troy, disintegrated around him. Whether truth or malicious fabrication, the image of Nero, artist and arsonist, became seared into history, his indifference to human suffering an indelible stain on his reign. When the fire finally exhausted itself, it left behind a wasteland. 10 of Rome's 14 districts were devastated, 3 completely obliterated, 7 heavily damaged. Ancient monuments, temples, and homes, some dating back centuries, were reduced to ash and rubble. Thousands were dead, tens of thousands homeless, their lives utterly shattered. The air hung heavy with the stench of smoke, charred wood, and unburied corpses. The sheer scale of the devastation was unimaginable, transforming the once vibrant heart of the empire into a grim, smoldering scar. Nero quickly returned to the city, making a show of organizing relief efforts, opening his own gardens to the homeless, and rushing supplies to the starving. But the public, devastated and suspicious, did not believe him. The rumors that he had ordered the inferno spread like wildfire through the surviving population. The idea that he, the emperor, would turn his own city into a funeral pyre was an accusation of unprecedented evil, a threat to his very legitimacy. Nero, always prone to paranoia and cruel impulse, knew he needed a scapegoat. And he needed one fast. His eyes fell upon a small, often misunderstood, and increasingly influential sect within Rome, the Christians. They were already viewed with suspicion by many Romans. Their refusal to worship the Roman gods, their strange rites, and their tendency to gather in secret bred mistrust. Rumors abounded that they engaged in cannibalism, atheism, and general hatred of humanity. They were, in short, the perfect target. Marginalized, unliked, and an easy diversion from Nero's own culpability. The persecution that followed was horrific, designed to satisfy the bloodlust of the Roman mob and deflect all blame from the emperor. Christians were rounded up, arrested without proper charges, and subjected to unimaginable tortures. Some were sewn into animal skins and thrown to hungry dogs in the arenas, torn apart for public amusement. Others were crucified, slowly expiring in agony. But Nero, ever the showman, saved his most macabre invention for the knights. He had Christians coated in pitch, set alight, and used as human torches to illuminate his private garden parties. Imagine the scene, the emperor, mingling with his guests, enjoying the spectacle of burning human beings, their screams filling the Roman night. This wasn't merely punishment. It was a theatrical display of cruelty, a calculated act of terror intended to erase any doubt about Nero's authority and deflect any lingering suspicion. The Great Fire, therefore, became a pivot point, not just for Rome, but for Christianity itself. It marked the beginning of state-sponsored persecution that would last for centuries, cementing the Christians' identity as martyrs and galvanizing their faith through unimaginable suffering. And for Nero, it solidified his legacy as a monster, an emperor whose name would forever be synonymous with madness, destruction, and a terrifying indifference to human life. The fire may have been an accident, but the choice to blame and brutalize an innocent group was an act of deliberate, calculated evil that echoes through the annals of dark history. The ashes of Rome were barely cool, the smoke still rising from the charred remains of centuries of history. But Nero, Rome's self-proclaimed architect of a new vision, wasn't dwelling on the devastation. No, he saw opportunity. A vast, open canvas for his megalomaniacal dreams. And so, he began construction on what would become the most infamous symbol of imperial excess the ancient world had ever seen, the Domus Aurea, the Golden House. This wasn't just a palace, it was an entire city within a city, built upon the ruins of Rome, sprawling across the Palatine, Esquiline, and Celian hills. It consumed lands that once held temples, public spaces, and thousands of homes, all to create a personal playground for the emperor. Imagine a complex so grand it was less a house and more a landscape theme park. At its heart, a colossal statue of Nero himself, over 100 feet tall, dominating the skyline, later adapted into the colossus that gave the Colosseum its name. Inside, the opulence was staggering. Walls gleamed with polished marble, inlaid with pearls and precious stones. Ceilings were frescoed, some even designed with movable ivory panels that could shower guests with flowers and perfumes. One dining room was famously circular and rotated constantly, mirroring the movement of the heavens, a mechanical marvel of engineering and luxury. Artificial lakes, vineyards, and pastures where wild and domestic animals roamed freely surrounded the main buildings. Even the baths flowed with seawater and sulfur water, piped in from miles away. It was a sensory overload, a testament to unchecked power and limitless ambition. But this golden dream was built on a foundation of popular resentment and an emptying treasury. The colossal cost of the Domus Aurea, coupled with the ongoing rebuilding of Rome itself, placed an unbearable burden on the provinces. Taxes soared, and wealthy senators and citizens found their property confiscated on trumped-up charges to fund Nero's extravagant tastes. The people who had lost their homes in the fire now watched as their emperor erected a monument to himself that literally occupied the city they had just seen burn. Whispers of his culpability in the great fire grew louder, fueled by the sheer audacity of his rebuilding project. Seneca, his former tutor and a leading intellectual, was forced to commit suicide. Petronius, the elegant arbiter of taste, suffered the same fate, supposedly for a satirical poem mocking the emperor. Nero's paranoia, already well established, now reached new heights, targeting anyone who dared to express the slightest dissent or even appear more talented than he. The stage was set for rebellion. The first serious challenge came in 68 AD, from Gaius Julius Vindex, the governor of Gallia Lugdunensis. Vindex, a Romanized Gaul, rallied his province against Nero's tyranny, specifically denouncing the heavy taxation and the emperor's neglect of public duty in favor of artistic pursuits. He declared his allegiance not to himself, but to the Senate and the Roman people, calling for a legitimate emperor. Nero, initially dismissive, continued his artistic endeavors, reportedly more concerned with a new water organ design than the uprising in Gaul. But the spark had been lit. Soon, other powerful figures, sensing Nero's increasing vulnerability, joined the fray. Servius Sulpicius Galba, the aged and respected governor of Hispania Tarraconensis, declared his support for Vindex and, critically, was joined by the legions stationed in his province. The military, the ultimate arbiters of imperial power, was turning against Nero. The once unshakable foundation of his rule began to crack. The critical blow, however, came from within Rome itself. Nymphidius Sabinus, the Praetorian prefect, seeing which way the wind was blowing, bribed the Praetorian Guard to abandon Nero and declare for Galba. This was the ultimate betrayal. The very soldiers sworn to protect the emperor now desired his downfall. The Senate, emboldened by the Guard's defection and weary of Nero's reign of terror, seized the opportunity. On June 8, 68 AD, they declared Nero a public enemy, a death sentence by ancient Roman law, which meant he could be killed by anyone without legal repercussion. Nero, suddenly isolated and facing imminent death, panicked. His few remaining loyal freedmen urged him to flee. Accounts describe a scene of pathetic desperation. He tried to organize an escape, but found his palace deserted, his guards vanished. He contemplated fleeing to Egypt, or throwing himself on the mercy of the Parthians, or even delivering a final, dramatic speech to the people begging for forgiveness. But his courage failed him. Dressed in a dark cloak, he slipped out of Rome under the cover of night, accompanied by 4 loyal freedmen, including his secretary Epaphroditus. He rode towards a villa owned by his freedman Phaon, stumbling and hiding in a ditch as passing riders approached, terrified of being recognized. Upon reaching Phaon's villa, a simple country estate, the once omnipotent emperor found himself reduced to a shivering, starving refugee. The freedmen dug a shallow grave for him, and he wept, bemoaning the loss of his beloved hair and lamenting the great artist he was. When he heard the hoofbeats of the soldiers sent to apprehend him, he knew his time was up. The Senate's decree meant a humiliating, agonizing death. He would be stripped naked, his head placed in a fork, and beaten with rods until he died. This ignominy was unbearable for the man who saw himself as a god. Still, he hesitated, unable to strike the fatal blow himself. He urged his companions to kill him, but they too recoiled. Finally, with the sound of approaching cavalry growing louder, he allegedly cried out, "Qualis artifex perio! What an artist dies in me!" And with the help of Epaphroditus, or perhaps gathering a final burst of resolve, he plunged a dagger into his throat. He was just 30 years old. Nero's death marked the end of the illustrious Julio-Claudian dynasty, the imperial line founded by Augustus himself. Rome was plunged into the chaos of the year of 4 emperors, a brutal struggle for power that only ended with the rise of Vespasian. Nero left behind a fractured empire, a legacy of terror and artistic vanity, and a reputation that would forever brand him as the mad emperor who burned Rome for his own twisted pleasure, a dark stain on the annals of human history. So, we've walked through the blazing inferno of Nero's reign, from the promise of a golden age to the bitter ashes of his demise. He remains one of history's most notorious figures, a name synonymous with debauchery, tyranny, and madness. But was he truly the monster history has painted, or a complex ruler whose story was amplified and distorted by his enemies and successors? The truth, as always, is murkier than the legend. Nero's monumental vanity and undeniable cruelty often came at his people's expense. Yet, he also implemented reforms, showed bursts of genuine compassion, and faced a public that often adored him, even as the elite despised him. He gave Rome its greatest fire, but also rebuilt it on a grander, safer scale. He crucified Christians, using them as convenient scapegoats for a populace demanding answers. The captivating image of Nero fiddling while Rome burned is likely apocryphal, powerful propaganda to cement his villainy. Nero's legacy is a chilling reminder of unchecked absolute power, and how easily a leader can descend into megalomania when surrounded by sycophants. But it also serves as a critical lesson in historical perspective, urging us to question narratives shaped by the victors. How much of the Nero we imagine is rooted in fact, and how much is a masterful construction of myth and vengeance? His story continues to echo through the centuries, a dark and compelling drama that asks us to confront the very nature of evil and governance. If you found yourself captivated by Nero's twisted saga, and enjoy peeling back the layers of history's most infamous figures, then consider hitting that like button, subscribing for more dark stories like this, and tell us in the comments, what do you believe was Nero's greatest crime, or his most misunderstood act? Let's explore these shadows of the past together.